Daryl Sawyer has come with his family to help us here at this Health and Healing Crusade. And not only do I want to wish his daughter, Christine, a happy birthday today, played the violin for us this morning, but for Daryl and his lovely wife, the whole family, to travel from Idaho quite a distance to come down here to partake of the event. And make sure before you leave that you visit his booth and get one of his CDs. You know, he's starting out in his ministry and he could certainly use some help and encouragement, and I listen to his music regularly and I thoroughly enjoy it. So remember Daryl and Moses' song booth over in the exhibition hall. As I said, Dr. McDougall will be signing these in the back towards the end. If you purchase one, bring it back and he'll gladly sign that. But I just want to introduce Dr. McDougall. He runs his clinic in Santa Rosa area, is it still? Santa Rosa, it's the McDougall Plan at the Flamingo Hotel, a beautiful program. In fact, I refer people there and I am just pleased because I know he does things right. He feeds them right, they prepare the food right, and they have a physician who wants to see them get off their drugs and to learn that they can lower their blood pressures or improve their diabetes, reverse their heart disease through nutrition and lifestyle. So let's welcome today Dr. John McDougall, author, friend, and a great addition to the Health and Healing Crusade every year.
You want me to do this? Okay, this. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be back. I think this is 4 or 5 years I've been here. And one of the things you've noticed is that every year I come back, I look better, right? Yeah. And you know why? I want to be quite honest with you. The reason why is I take better care of myself every year. You know, Mary isn't really 20 years old. As a matter of fact, she's, I'm not going to tell you. But she was accused at one of the conferences of having a body of a teenager. And I can attest to that. So, you know, that's the way I think it ought to be. You know, you ought to look good, feel good, and function well your whole life. And I honestly believe that as a doctor. But too often, as you know, people are deprived of that God-given gift of good health. And the reason they're deprived of it is primarily of ignorance. And you're real fortunate to have this kind of conference to come to hear a message of truth from many people, from Danny, from Dr. Neil Bernard, Dr. Deal, Howard Lyman. Many people have told you the truth. And the message is consistent and repeated over and over again. It's a message that, as you well know, is found in the Bible. The problem is that there's too much money trying to hide that truth from you. Now, I have changed my talk today, and I'm allowed to do that when I come and talk to a friendly group like this. I did it last year. If you remember, you were here last year. I talked to you about early detection. I talked to you about mammography. I talked to you about PSA tests. I talked to you about the fraud in the medical business. The year before, I talked to you about high-protein diets. I didn't plan that, but a couple of days before I came, but you were tolerant of my presentation. I told you about how these high-protein diets were wrong. You know that. Since that time I was here 2 years ago, what's happened is they've become more and more popular. So obviously we are not doing our job, are we? We should be out there spreading the message more about what dishonesty this is. As a matter of fact, there are now doctors out there, many doctors out there that prescribe high-protein diets to their patients. Shame on you. You should be disbarred. You should be taken out of the medical business because of the harm that you're doing to your patients, and I hope you get sued because you deserve it. But it just continues. You know, this kind of nonsense continues. So today, I'm taking a risk again. I'm giving you a presentation that I have never given before. As a matter of fact, I didn't really decide to do it until this morning, for sure. And hopefully it goes over well. But the reason I decided to do it this morning was because of an editorial in the San Francisco Chronicle. Okay? It's entitled Milk Duds. Did anybody see it? Milk Duds, San Francisco Chronicle, talks about how, you see, talk about shame on you. The school system takes drug money from the soda pop industry. You know about that. You know that the schools get money from the fast food industries, the soft drink industries to carry their products in the school. Well, they've gotten a lot of criticism for this. As a matter of fact, it's gone so far as legislation is being proposed and sometimes passed to stop that kind of behavior. Because, of course, we have an epidemic of obesity in our children, 25% of them at least being overweight, and many of these kids being very sick. Now, what they're going to do, according to this editorial, is they're going to compound the problem. They're going to make things worse. They're going to take and replace the Pepsi and the Coca-Cola with a drink that is worse, and that's milk. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking, this is never going to go over. He's never going to be able to convince me that it'd be better to serve soda pop to children than cow's milk. Well, let's see what I can do. Because I'm going to try my darndest. Now, they're not going to just serve cow's milk to the kids. No siree, they're going to serve cow's milk laced with high fructose corn syrup. In other words, sugar. And, of course, a lot of chocolate and other things to get them to drink it. Because the milk itself is so disgusting that they have to doctor it up to get the kids to drink it. But that's what they're going to do. And most people out there are going to think this is a good thing. So let's see what I can do to give you another point of view. And by the way, if any of you would like to review this or review the scientific literature and look up the original studies that I'm going to talk to you about, you can go to my website. In fact, I encourage all of you to spend time on my website. It's very simple. It's www.drmcdougall, which is DRMCDOUGALL, 2 L's, no period between DR and MCD. It's drmcdougall.com, very simple. And on that website, you'll find a discussion board. You'll find something called the Star McDougallers, which are people that have cured themselves of many problems by just taking advantage of a good diet and their God-given healing properties. They've cured themselves of rheumatoid arthritis, of lupus, of relapsing polychondritis, of heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, and so on. And they have cured themselves. And I don't use that word lightly and without any hesitation and without the slightest bit of lack of confidence that I could support that word cure to any physician in this audience or in this country. They cured themselves of these problems. So you'll find the Star McDougallers there, and you'll also find the archives of the newsletters since January of 2002. Last year, I got carried away about bowel problems. You remember when I was here about 4 years ago, I talked to you about the bowel problems? That was disgusting, wasn't it? Well, I wrote about it, and that's last year's newsletters. And then over this year, I've written about the hazards of consuming fish. That'll surprise a lot of you. And the last 2 newsletters I wrote to you about dairy products. This month, which comes out tomorrow's newsletter talks about mad cow disease, which you've probably heard a little bit about during this conference, talks about how to protect yourself from SARS, and talks about how to reverse atherosclerosis or cleaning out your arteries. So there's just a wealth of information there, and you can sign up for the newsletter either by signing a sheet of paper in the back, it's free, or you can go to the website and sign up, it's no problem at all. And you'll learn about the other things we do there, like the clinic and the trips and the videos and all kinds of things. But that brings me to the subject of today, and that is marketing dairy and disease. Could I have the first slide, please? Marketing dairy and disease, yeah. You see this? I was driving along the road, going out to Bodega Bay to windsurf a couple of weeks ago, and I looked out in the field, and look what I saw. So I had to stop and take a picture of this cow, because this cow reminded me of what the real value is of dairy and their message. It's fake. It's a fake cow, and the messages that they have are false promises. You remember the education that you got when you were growing up? You were educated by, who's the cow that teaches here? Is it Elsie? Is it Lonnie Moo? Is it Chloe? In Sonoma County, it's Chloe. Your cow must have a name. Elsie? Your cow's Elsie? Okay. I was raised with Elsie too. Anyway, the dairy industry spends millions of dollars every year trying to educate you. And they do it to sell $11 billion worth of milk and $16 billion worth of cheese, not to mention the other dairy products. And they do it very successfully. And they've started a new program, and you can learn about this on the internet if you want. It's called the Dairy Checkoff for 2003. And the Dairy Checkoff is designed to promote all aspects of milk sales, all the way from production to sales. And they have dedicated $165.7 million just this year to do that promotion. And some of the interesting things that you'll find when you read about that are statements like this. This ongoing program area, referring to the section on dairy image and confidence, aims to protect and enhance consumer confidence in dairy products in the dairy industry. Now, this is the important part. A major component involves conducting and communicating the results of dairy nutrition research showing the healthfulness of dairy products, regardless of the honesty. Oh, I added that, didn't I? As well as issues and crisis management. I have to tell you, I am crisis management. At least I will work as hard as I can to be crisis management for them, and I hope they dedicate some of those millions to dealing with me. Now, part of their strategy, and they state this right on the internet, listen to this. The goal is to guide school-age children to become lifelong consumers of dairy products. 2003 activities will target students, parents, educators, and school food service professionals. Where else have you heard those kinds of words? From the tobacco industry. That's exactly right, and the damage is just as severe from dairy products as tobacco. They just target younger people. I know you think I'm kidding. I couldn't possibly be that bad. Well, hold on. Annual fluid consumption among kids 6 to 12 increased to 28 gallons per capita. That means per person. The highest level in 10 years. Children under 18 drink 46% of the milk. They're successful. Now, one important thing I want to lay here for groundwork is that when I say milk, I'm talking about all dairy products. I'm talking about non-fat milk, I'm talking about kefir, yogurt, health food yogurt, yes, yogurt, cheese, cottage cheese, sour cream, butter. There's just a bit of difference between the protein, carbohydrate, and fat content, but the things I'm going to talk about apply to all these products in one degree or another, depending upon their major components. So when I say milk, you know I mean cheese, you know I mean yogurt, you know I mean cottage cheese. Just keep that in your mind. But I am not talking about human breast milk. And we have to get this absolutely straight and clear in your mind, is human breast milk is the ideal food for babies. As a matter of fact, you better hope it never happens. But if I became Surgeon General, I would outlaw formula. That'd be one of the first things that I would do. If you, mother, said you couldn't nurse that baby, the only way you'd get formula is you'd go to your doctor, you'd beg for a prescription just like you do for narcotics. And that doctor would be just as responsible for prescribing that formula to you as a doctor is for prescribing heroin or morphine or Demerol today, because that's a lethal prescription. So, just hope I don't get to be Surgeon General. Why do I say that? The advantages of human milk over cow's milk are the following. If you bottle feed your baby cow's milk formula or soy milk formula, the risk of sudden infant death syndrome, in other words, crib death or SIDS, is 2 to 4 times greater. Now, by the way, if you want to find the research to support any of these statements, they're in a book I wrote called The McDougall Program for Women. The baby has, during the first 3 months of life, 60 times the risk of developing pneumonia if it's bottle fed. 10 times the risk of hospitalization during the first year of life, reduced intelligence, the kids are stupider. You know, I tell my mother whenever I see her, I said, you know, if you would have breastfed me for more than 3 weeks, I'd have had Larry King's job. But that's all she knew, and then it was on to evaporated milk and Karo syrup. That's what mothers knew back then, unfortunately. Behavioral and speech difficulties for bottle-fed babies, an increased chance of suffering infections, asthma, eczema, type 1 diabetes, and cancers, including lymphomas and leukemias early in life, and then it carries on through the rest of your life if you deprive the child of the advantage of breast milk. And these are things like more heart disease, obesity, diabetes, multiple sclerosis, food allergies, ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease. I know I've made some of you feel terrible. I'm really sorry, but I'm not here to win a popularity contest. If only one life was saved, only one life was made better, it would be worth telling you this painful message. It is not right to bottle feed. And there are extremely few circumstances where it's absolutely necessary. And there's something called the Leche League that will be out there to help you. Okay, now let's get back to cow's milk. Now that I've made it absolutely clear the value of human breast milk, let's get back to cow's milk. Why is cow's milk wrong? Because it was designed for cows. That's why it's wrong. Milk is specifically designed for the species of animal involved. And the amount of protein, for example, in that milk and other nutrients depends upon how fast that animal grows. And let's take a look at this chart for just a minute because it tells a very important story. Look at the various animals in the first column. The next column represents the protein content in grams of that particular species' milk, and the next column represents the rate of growth, how fast an animal doubles in size. So, human beings double in size in 6 months. The protein content of their milk is very low. It's 1.2 grams per 100 cc's. A cow doubles in 47 days. The protein content is 3 to 4 times greater. Depending upon how you look at it, it's 3 to 4 times greater than human milk. The rat is one of the fastest growing animals, and the rat doubles its size in 4.5 days. The protein content is 11.8 grams per 100 cc's. So it's obvious that our nutritional needs are drastically different. That's why we need such a low protein diet. And a high protein diet is very toxic because our growth is so slow. It takes 14, 15, 16 years to grow to an adult. Cow's milk is ideal for baby cows. Take a look at some of the other issues in terms of dairy products. What I want to talk to you about are 10 false promises from the dairy industry. I want to talk to you about the sales pitch now. This is how they get you to buy the dairy products. There are 10 promises they make, and they're not true. The first one they make is milk builds strong bones. Well, build strong bones for cows. Of course, cows have big bones. Look at the calcium content of human milk, and look at the content of cow's milk. Cow's milk has 4 times as much calcium. The concentration is 4 times as great. You need all that calcium to grow a cow, but you don't need it to grow a person. If consuming all of that calcium resulted in healthier bones, then we wouldn't see so much osteoporosis in countries like the United States. 10 million cases of osteoporosis in this country. If calcium was the solution, that's not what we'd see. But the problem is, it's all that protein that we're feeding to the human being. That protein that would be ideal to grow a rat, or maybe a horse, or maybe a cow, but certainly isn't ideal for people. That protein not only is a serious burden on the body, but it carries with it acid. Acid is what dissolves the bones, and acid comes from the animal products. The high acid foods are your meat, dairy. Parmesan cheese, by the way, is the most acidic food that human beings consume commonly. Dairy, poultry, seafood, shellfish. These are your high acid foods. Your alkaline foods are fruits and dairy products, or fruits and vegetables. Those are your alkaline foods. Well, the body is slightly alkaline. That's the pH of the body. And when we eat high acid foods, what happens is the body has to neutralize that acid. The primary buffering system of the body is the bones, so the bones have to dissolve to neutralize that acid. So if we were eating a diet that is high in poultry and beef and cheese and low in vegetables, which are alkaline, then the acid has to be neutralized by dissolving the bones. And that's your initial and most important phase of osteoporosis. And then the protein itself actually causes changes in kidney physiology that cause you to lose that bone material into your kidney system. And not only do you lose your bones in the kidney system, but those bones, they solidify in your kidneys and cause calcium kidney stones. Now, if what I tell you is true, then we should see this in the worldwide picture. If you look at the hip fracture rate worldwide and you compare that to animal protein intake, you see a straight line correlation. The more animal protein consumed worldwide, the more hip fractures. For example, hip fractures are rare to non-existent in rural South Africa or Papua New Guinea. They're rare in Singapore and Hong Kong, again, where they eat a high vegetable-based diet, low animal product diet. as you increase the intake of protein worldwide, country by country, you increase the incidence of hip fractures. Now, what they tell us, though, is that calcium is the key. That's how you prevent hip fractures and keep your bones strong. Well, let's compare the worldwide picture, comparing hip fractures with calcium intake. And so you see this graph up here. What you notice is there's a similar straight line correlation. The more calcium consumed in a country, the more hip fractures. Now, the only way this situation can exist is if calcium intake has little or nothing to do with the strength of the bones, and that's what the truth is. Experiments that were finished in the early 1980s looked at people where they fed them various levels of calcium, and they either fed them a low protein or a high protein intake. The first column represents the initials of the principal investigators. The second column represents the calcium intake in each one of these individual experiments. And the third and fourth columns represent the calcium balance depending upon whether it was a low protein or high protein diet. Now, low protein is what you and I eat. High protein is the typical American diet. Low protein is about 85 to 90 grams of protein. Vegetable protein, of course, is much easier on the bones than animal protein. High protein diets are 140 to 150 grams of protein. And what you notice if you look at the figures here is that on low protein diets, the people in these experiments, no matter how much calcium you feed them, even if you feed them just a little bit of calcium, the calcium balance is positive. In other words, more calcium stays in the body than leaves. If you feed them a high protein diet, no matter how much calcium you feed them, they are in negative calcium balance. In other words, they lose more calcium out of the body through the feces and urine than they absorb from the gut. You know, these are figures that the dairy industry can't deny. There was a report in 1987 from National Geographic where they found two women that were buried in a flow of ice. They were sitting in their hut, and this big ice floe fell on top of them and froze them for 5 centuries. So here's a chance to observe the effects of diet on people 500 years ago. And they autopsied the two women, and they found that one was in her 20s, one was in her 40s. On autopsies, they found severe atherosclerosis, in other words, rotten hardening of the arteries, and they found severe osteoporosis in both women. And in this National Geographic article, they said that was due to their diet, a diet high in animal proteins. Now, a more recent experiment on the Eskimos was published in the early 70s. They took a look at the native Eskimos, and they looked at their bone density. And these are people, by the way, who ate not only fish, but ate fish bones, so they were consuming about 2,500 milligrams of calcium a day. And they examined their bone thickness, bone density, and they found their bone density was 10 to 15% less in every decade of adult life compared to Americans. Something the dairy industry can't deny. They try. Okay, false promise from the dairy industry number 2. They tell you that the research supports the fact that dairy is good for your bones. And you accept that without even questioning it. But let's look at the research. This was examined very carefully in a study that was published in September of 2000, in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. A couple of investigators took all the studies published on the effect of dairy products on bone health. I mean, it's an obvious thing to do, right? Okay, they took all the studies. They found of 21 studies that were properly done that 57% showed no significant benefit, 29% favored the statement by the dairy industry that milk was good for their bones, and 14% of the studies actually showed that consuming dairy products hurt the bones. And I want to point out something to you. Of the 57 studies that were examined, almost all of them were paid for by the dairy industry. And yet they still found these results. Now, the kind of studies that doctors and scientists like to look at are called randomized controlled trials. And what you do here is you randomize, you take your samples and you put them in one group or another by some type of randomization so there's no bias. And you have one group that does whatever you want to do, and the other group doesn't do it, and you compare the results, okay? You have a control group and you have an experimental group. Like, for example, when they tested Crest toothpaste. Why did we all buy Crest toothpaste? Well, they put advertisements on TV where they took kids and they had some of the kids brush with Crest, and they had some of them brush with a toothpaste that didn't have fluoride in it, and those who brushed with Crest had 37% fewer cavities, so we all brushed with Crest, right? Well, shouldn't you do the same thing with dairy products? Wouldn't you like to see that kind of research in your advertisements? I mean, after all, if they're going to claim that this is so good for the bones, then they ought to do this kind of study, okay? They ought to do this kind of study to show us the benefits. Well, they have done this study once. There are actually 7 randomized control studies, but only one of the studies look at postmenopausal women who drank milk. Only one. There's one of them that looked at a powdered substance. Several of them looked at women who were young or adolescent children, and I'll tell you how they got the results for them in a few minutes. But only one study have they ever done that looks at the effect of fluid milk on bone health of postmenopausal women. Yeah. It was published in 1985 by Ricker and Haney. We'll talk about that study in a few minutes. And that study shows that those who consumed the milk, which was 3 8-ounce glasses a day for a year, lost more bone than those who didn't get the milk. Published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, 1985. So the research absolutely does not support what they say, and yet they continue to advertise on TV how good milk is for the bones. False promise number 3, recommendations are easy to follow. You know, if you're going to consume the calcium recommended, you have to eat 6 ounces of cheddar cheese a day. Cheddar cheese is 74% fat. That would mean that 46% of your calories would come from cheese every day. In other words, you have to consume such a huge amount of dairy in your diet that it's almost practically impossible to do to meet the recommendations that are out there. This bit of information is going to surprise you, and that is they tell you, not only the dairy industry, but the organizations that are paid for and that work for the dairy industry, they tell you that you need huge amounts of calcium. But if you looked at the basic research, you'd find something completely different. What you'd find is the basic research shows that a person, a healthy person, even pregnant or nursing, needs between 150 and 200 milligrams of calcium a day. That's all you need. Calcium intake in underdeveloped countries, like in Africa or the Middle East, 300 to 500 milligrams a day. Americans, 500 to 600 milligrams a day. Recommendations go as high as 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams a day. Why the great disparity in figures? Why the research showing as little as 150 milligrams a day and people recommending as much as 2,000 milligrams a day, and you see everything in between? Why? Well, the reason is it doesn't make any difference, because the calcium balance in the body has almost nothing to do with how much calcium you feed to it. I say almost nothing. I'll tell you how it does in just a minute, but it's not because of the calcium. The reason is that the gut is intelligent. Okay, the intestine, your intestine is not a passive sieve. You know what a sieve is? You know, you go into the kitchen, you've got, you put your spaghetti in this bowl and the water goes right through. That's a sieve, okay? The gut is not a passive sieve, but this is what you may have thought and what I was taught to think. What I was taught to think is this: if you take calcium and put it in your mouth and you push it in hard enough and fast enough through the mouth into the intestine, you'll eventually push it so hard and so fast into the gut that you'll shove it through the gut wall like a passive sieve, and it'll go into the bloodstream, and you shove it hard enough, you'll shove it in the bloodstream up into the bones, and you'll shove it right into the bones. Thank God it doesn't happen that way. If it really happened that way, what would happen is we'd all die. If the gut was a passive sieve, we would die, and the reason is because the calcium would get into the heart and the kidneys and the muscles. We'd get soft tissue calcification, and we'd die. Fortunately, what the gut does when we are faced with large amounts of calcium, because we take handfuls of calcium pills or we take gallons of milk, is the gut blocks that calcium out. Now, if we take in lower calcium diet, and there's no such thing as a too low calcium diet, and I say that for one really important reason that I want you to hear very carefully. Calcium deficiency of dietary origin has never been described. In other words, there's not a single case in the world literature of a person developing a disease because they ate too little calcium. Never been reported. Now, the World Health Organization has looked for this. United States Department of Agriculture has looked for this. They've looked for a single case. There's never been a case reported. So when we take in lower amounts of calcium, because there's no such thing as too low of intake, because there's no diet that is too low in intake. I mean, why would God make such a mistake as to design the foods so that they weren't adequate. It doesn't make any sense at all. When we eat a lower calcium intake, what happens is those gut cells that are so smart enough to keep that excessive calcium out, they get very active and they grab that calcium and they bring it in and always meet our needs. And you say, well, what about osteoporosis? You overlooked osteoporosis as a disease due to calcium deficiency. You didn't hear a word I said, did you? I just told you if osteoporosis was due to lack of calcium, then in parts of the world where they eat the least calcium, they'd have the weakest bones. You know, if you couldn't grow strong bones without calcium in concentrated forms in your diet, we would have never had to fight World War II. Those Japanese people, they wouldn't have stood up against the next hurricane. Just wait till the wind blew them all apart. But the dairy industry is so powerful and so rich that they can convince people of such nonsense. False promise number 5, milk is best for bones. Well, we need nutrients for sure for the bones, and there are lots of nutrients, not just calcium. There's magnesium, phosphorus, all kinds of nutrients. And where do those nutrients come from? Where does calcium come from? Not milk. Where does calcium really come from? Not vegetables. Where does calcium come from? It comes from the ground. It comes from the ground. Of course it does. All your minerals come from the ground. You need all these minerals, absolutely, but their original source is the ground. So does that mean you should eat ground? No. What you do is you eat the secondary source, and that is that the minerals in the ground, they dissolve in watery solutions. They're taken up into the roots of plants. They're incorporated in the roots, stems, leaves, flowers, and fruits of plants. And then people come and eat the parts of the plants, and they get the calcium, and they always get enough calcium. Why do you know that? Because there has never been a case of dietary calcium deficiency ever reported in the world literature, so that must not be a problem. In fact, if there were a case of dietary calcium deficiency ever reported, it would be among the Eskimo. Because the Eskimo lives on such a high meat diet, and they didn't eat the bones. And by the way, there was just a study that came out last month on the Inuits, the Eskimos, children, and they found a population of children that had normal bone growth, and they estimate they were taking in 20 milligrams of calcium a day. Yeah. Because meat has virtually no calcium in it. Okay, so if we're going to get these essential minerals, we're going to get them from a more original source, and that is the plants, which get it right directly from the ground. There are many beneficial elements as far as bone growth is concerned. We need things like potassium and magnesium and beta-carotene and fiber. All of these things are as strong an influence on healthy bones as calcium ever thought of being. But why don't we hear about these things? Because there's no industry behind promoting these things. And how about the negative aspects? There are all kinds of harmful things when it comes to the bones. Why aren't you hearing day after day about the animal protein effects, about the effects of cigarette smoking and soft drinks and caffeine and salt on bones? Occasionally, but not very often. You know why. It's because it's not in the interest of the industry. Okay, false promise number 6. Milk is necessary for vitamin D. Where does vitamin D come from? That's right, it comes from the sun. Oh, it comes from the milk, sure. How does it get in the milk? They put it in just like you would a vitamin pill. Milk has almost no vitamin D in it. The way it gets in the milk is they dump it in as a supplement, that's how. And they consider it a good source because milk's so full of fat that the vitamin D is fat soluble, and so it carries nicely in the milk. But we should get our vitamin D from its most natural source, and by the way, you all know vitamin D is not a vitamin. It is a hormone. Vitamins we have to have from the food, hormones we make. It is a hormone. It's hormone D. It's made by sunlight's action on the skin. It converts plant sterols into vitamin D. False promise number 7, milk cures hypertension. Now, this is a study published in the American Journal of Hypertension. It's a review study published in 1999, paid for by the dairy industry. And they looked at 67 published studies, 47 proved eligible for review. In other words, they were well-designed studies. And they found an average decrease of 1.44 millimeters for the top number and 0.84 millimeters for the bottom number. In other words, about a 1-point drop in blood pressure. And this was paid for by the dairy industry. Do you know, at our clinic, for people with high blood pressure, we get a 23/14 millimeter drop in blood pressure, in most cases within 72 hours, and we get almost everybody off their blood pressure pills. And they're bragging about a 1-point drop in blood pressure. And they sit out and they market to you, you've got to drink milk because it'll lower your blood pressure. It's a lie. And they pay for it too. Okay, false promise number 8, milk prevents colon cancer. Well, maybe. There's some studies that indicate it, some animal studies that indicate it, but every single researcher in the world knows what causes colon cancer. It's what you put in your colon. There's no dissension on this. Everybody knows it's the American diet. It's the fat, the meat, the lack of fiber. All researchers know this. This chart here shows you the worldwide distribution of colon cancer and compares it to the diet. And what you find is you increase your fat intake worldwide, you increase your risk of colon cancer. So how all of a sudden do dairy products become the answer to colon cancer? The way you solve the colon cancer problem is you now put a slice of cheese over your beef steak. That's what they'd like you to do, but it's not true. Okay, now let's see. Low-fat dairy products are health food. Now this little bit of information I need to have you memorize because it's important for the rest of the talk I'm going to give you. Whole milk is 50% fat. Now it's advertised to you as 3.5% fat, but that's by weight, and of course milk is mostly water. So of the weight of the milk, 3.5% of the weight is fat, but nobody eats a diet based on weight. None of you eat a 5-pound diet. You eat a 2,000 calorie diet, for example. So you need to have as the common denominator not weight, but calories. When you look at the calories, of all the calories in whole milk, nearly 50% of them are fat, 21% protein, and 30% are carbohydrate. Now, when they start to take the fat out, some interesting things happen. One thing that happens is the protein goes up, and the other thing that happens is the carbohydrate goes up. And so low-fat milk, which is advertised as 2% milk, is actually 31% fat. Skim milk, of course, is really defatted. It's 2% blue milk. But notice from the chart what happens is you take the fat out, you increase the relative concentrations of milk sugar, which we're going to talk about, and also milk protein. Keep that in mind because it's important for the rest of the conversation because we're going to be talking about problems associated with the milk protein. False promise number 10. Milk is as pure white as the driven snow. One of the reasons it's so pure white is because it contains white blood cells. These are also known commonly as pus cells. Well, it's okay because an act passed in 1993 tells the dairy industry that they only allow 750,000 pus cells for every cc of milk or it can't be sold. Pretty nice of them, huh? You think I'm joking, don't you? No, it's true. That's the law. And these are pus cells, white blood cells they're called. A recent study in New York State found an average of 363,000 white blood cells per cc. A cc is a 1/30 of an ounce. It's 5 drops. And those 363,000 white blood cells were there to fight off the 24,000 bacteria. Can you imagine truth in advertising? Can you imagine if the dairy industry was required truth in advertising and they had the celebrity, the baseball player, the model, their picture in the magazine with the white mustache, and they had a label that said 400,000 white blood cells and 25,000 bacteria per cc, per mustache? Okay, dairy products were the foods most often recalled by the by the FDA from the period of October 1st, 1993 to September 30th, 1998 because of infection mostly. Because of contamination with things like salmonella, staphylococcus, listeria, deadly E. coli, you know the E. coli that kills the children, Mycobacterium paratuberculosis, which is believed to cause Crohn's disease, which is a debilitating, life-threatening bowel disease. Dairy products are number one as far as recalled products. AIDS and leukemia viruses. That ought to get your attention. Dairy cattle are infected. They're infected with bovine immunodeficiency virus. This is also known as bovine AIDS virus. And they're infected with bovine leukemia viruses. And these viruses are in a lot of the cattle. I'll show you how many in just a minute. And they make cattle sick. And they're spread among various cattle. They're spread by using the same dehorning instruments, by using the same needle to give them antibiotics that they inject in the cattle. They're spread by feeding pooled colostrum. In other words, they take milk from many cows and feed it to the young calves in a mixture that comes from many different cows. And also, they still do, hasn't changed. They also get it because I can imagine it still has to be the case. They stopped feeding offal. You know what offal is, right? O-F-A-L. Not A-W-F-U-L. Offal is downer cows. Cows that fall over dead because they're sick with pneumonia or leukemia or lymphomas. And you don't want to waste those cows, so you grind them up, right? And you put them in the cattle food. Well, they did that until 1997 when Howard Lyman and Oprah went on. Howard told you about this yesterday. When they went on TV and made such a stink about it, I was told 17% of the cattle food was made up of dead cows. So that's one way they used to spread it. Now, did you read the USA Today article last week or 2 weeks ago? Front page, USA Today. Nobody read that? It was about the continued use of animal products to feed animals. And they still use the cow's blood in cattle food and to feed to the baby cows. You think I'm kidding, don't you? It's in this month's newsletter. You can read about it. And they're still allowed to feed the dead cows to chickens and to pigs. Yeah, well, that's one other way they spread it. Okay, let's talk about the AIDS and leukemia viruses. In the United States, results show that an average of 40% of the beef herds and 64% of the dairy herds are infected with bovine immunodeficiency viruses. In Canada, the infection rate is 70%. In Argentina, the rate is 84% are infected. Herds infected with bovine immunodeficiency or bovine AIDS viruses are usually infected with the leukemia virus also. Both viruses can cross species lines, infecting other animals like sheep, goats, and chimpanzees, and they develop disease. Nationwide and worldwide, leukemia is more common in higher consuming dairy populations. An increased incidence of leukemia has been found among dairy farmers in at least 5 different studies. Bovine immunodeficiency virus has been reported in a person. Bovine leukemia viruses have been classified in the same group as human leukemia, lymphotrophic viruses, which are the ones that cause leukemia and lymphomas in humans. They're almost indistinguishable. Bovine AIDS virus is structurally and genetically closely related to human immunodeficiency viruses. You can almost not tell them apart. They're just so extremely close. Pasteurization kills many kinds of viruses, but it's not foolproof. And there's concern that when you take these, they're called retroviruses, and the way they infect is they get into your cells and they get incorporated into your DNA, and that's how they cause the leukemia. Well, the concern is that the parts of the virus, the fragments, after they're broken up by pasteurization, may be more easily incorporated than the whole virus. Now you say, well, why don't I hear about this? Because the dairy industry isn't going to promote it. Well, has the dairy industry gone to the trouble to prove that it's safe to drink dairy products because of the bovine AIDS and leukemia viruses? Of course they haven't. How much research is there to show that it's safe? Almost none. Has it been proved that drinking milk causes leukemia and AIDS in people? No, it hasn't. But has anybody tried to prove it doesn't? No, and it hasn't. Is anybody concerned about this? Well, yes, they are. In Europe, they've had eradication programs where they have killed the cows that are infected with these viruses. In fact, in Sweden, they just declared victory, that they actually eradicated all of the cows that are infected. Some people take this very seriously, but not in this country. We don't. You know that leukemia viruses are important because you take your cat to the veterinarian for a feline leukemia shot, don't you? Vaccination, sure. Okay, one of the goals, as we talked about in the beginning of the dairy industry, is to market to children. And so they have the American School Food Service Association. to help market dairy products, and so they developed a school milk pilot test program. And it's been very successful. As I showed you, they've increased the consumption of cow's milk, and they're going to do it even more with this approach by adding all kinds of sugar to the milk and chocolate, so they're going to really get a lot of milk in the kids. Let's take a look at some of the results of all this marketing. An interesting study done in the New England Journal of Medicine, published in 1998, published from Italy. They took 65 severely constipated boys and girls, and these children were so badly constipated that they didn't have a bowel movement but every 3 to 12 days. And at that, they usually had to have strong laxatives to get them to move their bowels. Okay? So they took these kids and they put them on a dairy-free diet, and they found that 68% of them, in other words, 44 of the 65, obtained complete relief of their constipation by just getting off the dairy. Now, these children, they biopsied the bowel of these children. They found a severe inflammatory reaction, and they found how the dairy protein paralyzed. The dairy protein, remember the stuff that you get more of when you skim the milk? The dairy protein paralyzes the child's bowel. And as a result of all this constipation, the kids suffer fissures and severe pain and suffering and embarrassment and psychological trauma. Now, 12 months later, foolish as the parents must have been, they asked the children who responded to the cow's milk by getting off of it to go back on the cow's milk, and all of them developed severe constipation in 5 to 10 days. You know, if it was just for the constipation alone, forget the obesity, forget the leukemia, forget the other stuff we're going to talk about. If it was just for the constipation alone, which, by the way, is not caused by Coke and Pepsi being sold in the soda machines, and don't you think that I'm advertising that we start doing that. I'm just trying to give you a comparison. If it was just for the constipation alone, and if anybody had a bit of honesty, they would ban these products not only from the schools, but from the supermarkets. Now, most of you who have kids, and certainly all of you who live in neighborhoods, know about the snotty noses and ear infections. Now, not only do these kids have snotty noses and ear infections, the same kids also have gastroesophageal reflux from the dairy. They get asthma and they get eczema. I remember my little sister growing up. This was really a traumatic thing for our whole family. We had no idea it was the milk. But I remember until she was 9 years old, she scratched day and night from the eczema, day and night. The suffering that goes on is unbelievable. Okay, why again, why would this happen? Why would we have these problems? The problem is milk is an unnatural thing. It's not supposed to be fed to people. Cow's milk is not. Okay, here's another problem from cow's milk. I mean, if constipation doesn't get to you, how about this one? The American Academy of Pediatrics work group on cow's milk protein and diabetes. Do you know what diabetes is, type 1 diabetes? Terrible thing. I'm sure some of the parents here and the children know of people with type 1 diabetes. Hopefully no one suffers from it. It's a lifelong disease. The pancreas is dead as far as insulin production. It occurs as a consequence of cow's milk consumption, or at least the American Academy of Pediatrics believes so, and so do I. And so does the scientific research state, at least that research not paid for by the dairy industry. Of course, they're out there, as their first statement said, remember in the beginning of the slide presentation, they're out there to promote research that favors dairy product sales. They say it right in their mission statement. So they're out there paying for research that doesn't support the things that I'm telling you. Even though, as far as I know, there's never been a study that shows milk doesn't cause constipation. Oh yeah, it does cause diarrhea if you're lactose intolerant. But the American Academy of Pediatrics, they say in their statement that was published in 1994, early exposure of infants to cow's milk protein may be an important factor in the initiation of beta cell destruction process in some individuals. Beta cells where the insulin is produced. The avoidance of cow's milk in the first several months of life may reduce the later development of insulin-dependent diabetes or delay its onset in susceptible people. All kinds of problems are caused by dairy protein. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. If you go to the National Library of Medicine, which is nlm.nih.gov, you go there, National Library of Medicine, and you put in cow's milk and any of these diseases, you'll read for weeks. Upper gastrointestinal problems like canker sores, gastroesophageal reflux, lower gastrointestinal problems like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, constipation, all kinds of colitis problems, Respiratory problems like asthma and wheezing and nasal stuffiness, bone problems. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. You want to talk about a child suffering. You know how these little kids do? You've probably never seen one. I've seen too many in my career. These poor little children, they look like refugees from a prisoner of war camp, from a concentration camp. They're about this big, and they're all shriveled up like people starving to death. And they don't live very long either. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis, terrible thing. Also, I just published a study. In fact, I published about 2 years ago. If you want to go to my website, there's an article called Diet Only Hope for Arthritis, and there it lists 25 studies that show you can cure inflammatory arthritis, including rheumatoid arthritis, by getting off the dairy and changing your diet. And we published a study 2 years ago just on this. The results were about 70% of people showed dramatic benefit or cure of their rheumatoid arthritis. Skin problems we talked about. Multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, autism, schizophrenia, irritable bowel, restlessness, bedwetting. This is a good one. Bedwetting problems. These are the kinds, forget the leukemias. Forget the rheumatoid arthritis. It's the constipation and the bedwetting that'll get your attention, right? Yeah, this is the thing. You take the kid to the psychiatrist every month faithfully, and you sit there and feel guilty about what you might have done. You might have touched the kid in the wrong place or said the wrong thing to the child. And so you think that you have this emotionally damaged family that's causing the child to wet his or her bed. I'll tell you what it is. Kid drinks the milk goes through the gut wall, gets into the bloodstream, gets into the bladder in some children. Gets into the bladder. In the bladder, it causes the bladder tissues to swell like a big hive, and they become insensitive when they swell, so the kid can't feel the urine in the bladder. So they go to sleep at night, and the next thing the child knows is the bed sheets are wet because they couldn't feel the bladder filling up. Take the kid off the milk, cured the psychiatric problem. Amazing, huh? In fact, I gave a talk here one year. I told that story, and I got a letter from one of you thanking me because your child responded just as such. Okay, all kinds of kidney problems. In fact, there's a fellow here today. I don't know whether I get a chance to meet him, but he told me that he had 25% of his kidney function left. I got the letter this morning on the email. I get emails every day. I always answer them personally in case you ever want to talk to me. And got it just this morning and said they were going to be here at the conference, and he's already lost 75% of his kidney function. And often that is due to animal protein and an immune reaction like animal protein such as dairy protein. Okay, let's move on. This is a great one. Milk is now advertised as the anti-obesity drug of the 21st century. Honest to God, folks. Honest, I'm not kidding you. Let me show you what they do. By the way, you may meet this guy, Greg Miller. He was a lot of fun. He was on my television show one year. One year I did a show with Virgil Halse. Anybody know Virgil Halse? One of my heroes. Yeah, Virgil Halse. Great guy. I've been around a long time. You have too. Virgil Halse, greatest guy in the world. He used to be a California dairy inspector, had his master's in public health. He was an MD, lived up in Oregon, I believe. And we did a show one time, it was about 12 years ago, on Lifestyle Magazine, which was a show that was before my show, which was McDougall, MD. And we did this show on dairy, and we talked about the heart disease. You notice I haven't even talked about the heart disease yet and other things related to dairy. We talked about the heart disease and so on. We talked about mad cow 12 years ago. We talked about the bovine leukemia, the bovine AIDS viruses. We just really let them have it for a half an hour. Well, the dairy industry got mad. And so they said, we need our equal time. And so they wrote my producers, and they said, we want to send our representative, which is Dr. Greg Miller, who is a PhD. I mean, this is no lightweight. He's the #1 promoter of dairy. He's their man in the publicity department. Still is today, was back 12 years ago, Greg Miller. And so he shows up on the show, and my producer said, yeah, but McDougall's going to be there too. You and I are going to walk on stage alone. So anyways, we start talking. I start going through the whole thing, the diabetes, the constipation, the diarrhea, on. And the guy just sits there numb. This is a beautiful, beautiful show. In fact, many of you have seen it. And I still have people who ask me for these tapes, the one that Virgil and I did first, and then the next one. What they do is they get groups of vegetarians together. And they say, you like dairy, but we want to show you another side of the story. And then they show Virgil's and my show. And then they say, well, the dairy industry must have an answer to this, right? They said, yeah. They wouldn't get away with this. Okay, they said, come back next week and we'll show you the show with the dairy industry on it. And this is a setup. So they come back the next week and they play the show with Greg Miller and I on it. And so I go through the whole business, waiting for this guy to respond. And he just sits there numb. And finally, about 15 minutes into the show, he reaches in, pulls out his wallet, opens up his wallet and asks the camera to come over and look. He says, see these 2 kids? These are my kids. If dairy product was bad, I wouldn't feed it to them. That's all he had to say for half an hour. Okay, but this is Dr. Greg Miller. He's still the head honcho there, head nutritionist for the dairy industry. His official statement in the 2001 dairy checkoff is this: independent research confirming dairy's role in weight reduction is mounting. This helps to position dairy foods as part of the solution to America's growing obesity epidemic. That's what he says. Informing the public about dairy's role in the fight against obesity will help increase consumption of milk, cheese, yogurt, and among other dairy products. This is what he says. When did cow's milk become an anti-obesity drug? Cow's milk is designed to grow a baby cow from 60 pounds to 600 pounds. That's its job. How did it become a weight loss product? Well, of course, it's not. One of the 17 randomized studies, by the way, this is paid for by the dairy industry again. They're paid for all these studies. It's just that the studies show it doesn't work and it's harmful, and then they lie about it. So, one of the 17 randomized studies found weight loss in people taking calcium pills, and of the 9 randomized studies where fluid milk was added, 2 showed significant weight gain, and none showed significant loss. Yet, Greg Miller and the rest of the dairy industry is going to be out there tomorrow telling you this is what you should do for weight loss. Aren't you mad? Aren't you furious? I can't believe it. Okay. In one study, funded by a grant from the International Dairy Foods Association, 204 healthy men and women were asked to increase their intake of skim milk and 1% milk by 3 cups a day for 12 weeks. Those consuming the extra milk gained an average of 1.32 pounds. What if they asked them to eat yogurt and cheese and cream cheese and cottage cheese? They'd be blimps. Yet it's a weight loss product. Okay, new promotion. This is all new stuff. This is what the dairy industry is going to get you for the rest of the year. I'm going to get you ready for it. Milk builds strong bone. Protein builds strong bones, they tell you. The new research that they've paid for in the meat industry, hey, don't leave the beef industry out of this. They're paying for some of this too. The new research shows protein builds strong bones. So what you're going to hear from your respected scientists and doctors is it's all controversial. Some show proteins harms the bone. Some show it's good for the bones. Well, how can that be? How can the truth be confused like that? And you won't know how unless you remember what I'm going to tell you. I'll show you how to make the truth, how to make a lie the truth. By the way, they have the 3-day plan, eat 3 dairy products a day. This is a takeoff from the 5-a-day fruits and vegetable campaign that's been out there for years. Okay, now remember I told you about the one randomized controlled study that was done to test fluid milk on postmenopausal women? Here's the conclusion from Ricker and Haney. This is what they write. By the way, those who received the extra milk lost more bone than those who didn't get the milk. And this is what they say. Remember, they are now saying protein builds bones. The protein count of the milk supplement may have a negative effect on calcium balance, possibly through an increase in kidney losses of calcium or through a direct effect on bone reabsorption. That's what they said in 1985, 20 years ago. This may have been due to an average 30% increase in protein intake during milk supplementation. So they know this. It's not like they're ignorant. They know this. Ricker, by the way, and Haney's the #1 honcho putting out this nonsense in terms of research. He's their big man. Well, if you want to read about how they do it, I'll show you how they do it. It was published last month in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. This is how you show protein's good for the bones. What you do is you design your experiments. You either look at populations of people who have high fruit and vegetable intake, so all the acid is neutralized. Remember, fruits and vegetables are high in alkaline material. So you neutralize all the acid from the cheese and the meat with all the vegetables, or you give calcium pills. Now, what are calcium pills made of? Calcium citrate, calcium bicarbonate. They're made of strong bases, so you neutralize the acid. Okay, now once you neutralize the acid, any growth-promoting effects of dairy or meat or any protein will be seen, right? Okay, so now they got it. The growth-promoting effect of dairy, okay, is something called insulin-like growth factor 1. You're going to hear a lot about this. You might as well learn about it just like you learned about osteoporosis and homocysteine and so on. Learn about insulin-like growth factor 1 because they're going to be knocking you over the head with it. Insulin-like growth factor 1 is a growth-promoting substance that looks like insulin that promotes growth. So now we know how protein and dairy stimulate bone growth, right? We've got it. They're not going to be able to deny this. The advertisements are solid. The research is there. There's no problem at all. As a matter of fact, they have been making milk more profitable by increasing the productivity of the cows by adding something called recombinant growth factor, bovine growth factor, RBGH. They approved it in 1985. Big controversy about it. You can get this insulin-like growth factor 1 at even higher levels in the milk by doing this, okay? Boy, we can really get those bones growing, can't we? As a matter of fact, 2 studies they showed. I mean, the dairy industry has got this nailed. They've got this insulin-like growth factor 1 nailed. They've done 2 studies, one on adolescent girls and one on postmenopausal women, where they showed by feeding milk, they increased the insulin-like growth factor 1 in the women's bodies by 10%. Okay, dairy industry's got it. But they forgot to tell you something, folks. Insulin-like growth factor 1 is the strongest cancer promoter that we have in our whole diet. Yeah, it promotes growth. It promotes proliferation of cells and inhibits cell death. And it's been strongly linked to, more strongly than anything else, linked to lung, breast, colon, prostate, and other kinds of cancers. They are going to get hit in the face with the biggest mud pie in the world when this comes out. Yeah, you may have strong bones, but you're not going to live very long to enjoy them. And that's what the truth is. So, insulin-like growth factor 1. Memorize it. You're going to hear about it. They may even have that mustache, 350,000 white blood cells, 25,000 bacteria, and more insulin-like growth factor 1. Okay, let's see. What has the dairy industry done that's kind of cool? Remember I didn't mention heart disease and high blood pressure and diabetes and obesity? Not too much about it. That's what you've known dairy products are associated with. Well, now the dairy industry is paying for researchers to write articles that say that milk doesn't cause these things. Yeah! In fact, they've enlisted the National Medical Association to write articles, and this is on their website. Go to Dairy Checkoff 2003. That's where I got all this. I didn't make this up. Okay, so the dairy industry has hired the National Medical Association to write articles about the role of dairy in helping reduce the risk of heart disease, hypertension, and other serious illnesses. Can you imagine that? Well, who is the National Medical Association? This is what really kills me. The National Medical Association is a group whose purpose is to promote the welfare of African Americans. How do African Americans do with milk? 90% of them have lactose intolerance. They get diarrhea and stomach cramps and gas from it. How in the world can an organization of African American physicians tie up with the dairy industry? It must be millions of dollars that have bought that one. I cannot. That just overwhelmed me. I couldn't believe it. Okay. Just to summarize, I want to tell you how I feel about milk in case you haven't heard. You have a feeling about red meat. You think it's horrible, right? Well, all I want you to know is dairy is just liquid meat. That's all. Just liquid meat. Look at the macronutrient content. Compare ground beef to cheddar cheese. Look at the fat content. Look at the protein content. Look at the carbohydrate, the fat. They're virtually the same. It's just liquid meat is all it is. So it promotes heart disease and type 2 diabetes and obesity and high blood pressure, and other forms of atherosclerosis, just like red meat does. Don't fool yourself. Yet, I tell you, you have learned, and you've treated your family this way, and stop it right now. You've treated your family like dairy products were health food, Mother Nature's most perfect food, and it's such a serious mistake. If I could eliminate one group from the basic 4 food groups, it would be the dairy group. Yeah, that's the one that would go. Thank you very much.